Okay, it's 7:30. I see we have some people. Welcome to the session on energy and sustainability in the Global South. Can people nod if they can hear me? See some nodding? I'm not seeing any nodding. Okay, I saw a thumbs up. Hi, Eric Williams. Welcome to the session. Very glad to see this topic as part of the conference. We have a great set of papers. Protocol, each talk will be 10, 12 minutes long, and then we'll have around 5 minutes for questions and answers, and then move on to the next talk. I think it looks like for questions that there are one option to do a question is that there is a question button that you'll see and ask. And if you type a question there, that'll get forwarded to me. Megan, who is our person behind the scenes making sure this will all work, if people raise their hand, is it possible to put them on the podium to ask their questions via? Okay, and Megan has just texted me yes. So that's an option. I think it doesn't look like a huge group, and so feel free to just raise your hand and then ask your questions using sound. So with that, let's get started. And our first talk is by Ana Lucia Caceres from Carnegie Mellon University on assessing the potential for complementary hydropower resources across 3 African power pools in a changing climate. Ana, the virtual floor is yours.
Great, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen. Okay, I think it's good. So, hi everyone, my name is Ana Caceres. I am a PhD candidate from Carnegie Mellon University in engineering and public policy, and also in civil and environmental engineering. And today I'm going to be presenting part of my work on assessing the potential for complementary hydropower resources across Africa in a changing climate. So currently, more than 500 million people in Africa still lack access to modern electricity services. And what we see here in this map, and this is from 2016, so the numbers might be slightly different, is the number of people without electricity access. And it can be seen that there's a large portion of the people without electricity access around the world are located specifically in sub-Saharan Africa. So currently, it's around 578 million people in sub-Saharan Africa don't have access to modern electricity services. And there's a little bit less than 1 million in Northern Africa that don't have access to electricity. So hydropower is and has been an important source for electricity in the continent, and it is expected to continue to play an essential role in meeting the electricity demand increases that are expected. There's been different studies and estimates, but some studies say that there will be increases up to 5 times the current electricity demand by 2050. And it is expected that hydropower will continue to be very important in the continent. And here in this map, what I'm showing basically is where the first map on the left side shows where there is where the installed capacity is in the different countries, and then on the right is how much that capacity in actual generations represents of a share. So we can see that there's a number of countries that are hydropower dependent, which means that more than 50% of their electricity actually comes from hydropower, 50% or more. So as we can see, for example, the Democratic Republic of Congo, right in the middle here, has almost more than 80% of its electricity comes from hydropower, and there's a number of other countries that is also the case. But we also know that climate change can threaten the viability of hydropower development, and this means that climate change can affect different precipitation patterns and temperature that can make certain regions around the continent drier, while other regions can get more water. And this directly affects hydropower operations and development. And knowing that the region will continue to rely on hydropower to meet a lot of its growing electricity demand, it is important to try to understand and characterize what are these effects going to be across the different power pools. So what we did is we look at, I know the title originally said 3, but currently I expanded the work and I look at all 5 different power pools in the African continent, and that this includes the Northern Africa power pool, which is the Maghreb Electricity Committee, the West African power pool, the Central African power pool, the Eastern African power pool, and finally the Southern Africa power pool. So I look at all hydropower plants with an install capacity larger than 50 megawatts across these different 5 power pools. So this includes 27 different countries and a total of 87 hydropower plants. And then I look into potential changes in usable capacity of hydropower plants under 2 different emission scenarios using a multi-model ensemble. And then I also go one step further and analyze if there's potential synergies for these hydropower resources across these power pools. So in order to do this, the first thing that I needed to do was to project hydropower usable capacity, which is just, it basically means it's the maximum power that can be sustained by a hydropower plant on a monthly basis once I simulate stream flow into the future. So I use climate model outputs for precipitation and temperature to drive a water balance model for each hydropower plant that I mentioned. And with that, I can simulate hydropower operations into the 21st century under these 2 different emission scenarios. So I look at RCP 4.5 and RCP 8.5, which 4.5 is a mid-emission scenario and 8.5 is a business as usual or higher emission scenario. And with this, I get a time series of usable capacity, which is just power from these hydropower plants into the 21st century under 21 different climate models and 2 RCPs. So once I have the time series of usable capacity, I look into 2 other things. I look into how the supply, this usable capacity is varying. So look at the variability of supply. And then I look into the potential of complementarity. So looking at the synergies between these different power plants and then also at the country level. So in order to assess these variability that I mentioned, I look into 2 different things. I look into the interannual variability and the seasonal variability. And what this means is just the coefficient of variation of these usable capacity time series on an annual basis to understand how supply might be changing from year to year. And then on a seasonal basis, looking at monthly projections of usable capacity and looking how the changes could be happening within a year. And then I also look into different metrics to try to understand how power plants can be complementary, which means that you could potentially use one power plant or a country's hydropower resources to balance out a different country during a different season. So for example, if you have the rainy season of one country during the dry season of another country, they could potentially align together. So in order to assess, and they could help each other, balance each other out. So in order to assess this, I look into 3 different metrics that I combine. And the first one is a temporal correlation, which is just a Pearson correlation that looks into how the time series of usable capacity are correlated throughout the years. And then I look into if these power plants are temporally complementary, if they have the same size, so that you could balance each other out on a power side of things. And then finally, I look into the distance that it would take to interconnect these power plants, because currently transmission is limited in the continent. So that is an important factor to consider, because when suggesting potential complementarities between different power plants, if they're not currently linked through a transmission line, that would not be feasible. So a transmission line would need to be built. So with this, the first part, as I mentioned, was to look at the changes in usable capacity. And what I'm showing here is just the changes in this capacity throughout the century. So this is just showing for RCP 4.5 for the near future. The changes are relatively smaller, but as we go into the century, we can see that there's changes depending on the power pool that are on the opposite spectrum. So for example, we can see that Eastern Africa has potential for increases in usable capacity by the end of the century, and also by mid-century. It's just that by the end of the century they're more noticeable. And then the Southern Africa power pool has actually decreases. So that could be problematic, but it furthers the case for interconnection within the region. So then when looking at the second aspect of the variability, this map currently shows the existing transmission lines in the continent, and some of the countries are currently isolated even from their own power pools that they belong to. So some of the interesting things that we've been able to find, and there was a lot for each one of them, so I'm just summarizing these quickly, is that, for example, Cameroon, that is currently not interconnected to the Central Africa power pool where it belongs, has large seasonal variability. And this could be problematic because they cannot balance out any of their loads with any other country because they're not currently interconnected. Another thing is that the Democratic Republic of Congo, their seasonal variability is actually, we see that it actually decreases throughout the century under RCP 8.5, which should actually be positive, and it could actually make the supply more reliable for them. And on the other hand, South Africa, seasonal and interannual variabilities, when we assess them, we're seeing them increase throughout the century, which would actually be the opposite effect than what we're seeing in the Congo. So keeping all of these things in mind, we start looking at the different, we assess the different complementarities between countries. So this is at the country level, but we also have done this at the power plant level, seeing which pairs of power plants could complement each other out. And here we just basically have all of the 27 different countries on both sides. And we're looking at this complementary index that I mentioned previously, in which what we're interested to look at are the more negative the index, the better, the more complementary the power plant. So we can see that the darker blue colors are where there's highest potential for complementarity for these power plants. And then as we go into the century using different, the average of the emission scenarios, we can see that there's particular changes. And again, the more negative, the better. It means that the complementary relationship becomes stronger. So there's, in this bottom half where we have the more bluish colors, there's some complementarities that are becoming stronger, which would actually be better for countries to balance each other out. So these, we look into all of these different countries and their different power plants, and we find and propose potential pairs of countries and power plants that could help balance each other out into the 21st century. So just the quick conclusions that we can get from this type of analysis and work is that, well, first of all, we see potential increases and decreases in usable capacity for the power plants, depending on the region, which is not that surprising. And this, for example, there's increases in the Eastern Africa power pool and decreases in the Southern Africa power pool. Then we are also seeing increased seasonal and interannual variability that would decrease the reliability of hydropower supply across all power pools. We see 17 countries with increases in seasonal variability and 24 with increases of interannual variability. Not all of these increases are statistically significant, but we're seeing some. And then the countries which are currently not interconnected, such as Angola and Cameroon, as I mentioned before, could be most vulnerable to these changes in both usable capacity and variability because they're not able to balance each other out with other countries. And then exploring these complementarities inside power pools and then across power pools can actually make the hydropower supply in the region more reliable and more resilient to future changes. And considering that a lot of these countries are hydropower dependent, being able to map these changes and map which potential countries they could balance each other with is important for planning decisions into the 21st century. So with that was my presentations, and I'll take any questions.
Very interesting. So questions either by raising your hand or by sending a text. Well, okay. In the meantime, I guess in the meantime, I have a question. So I think that your measures, and correct me, correct me if I'm wrong, is that you were looking at the potential production in a given region and then comparing it with the demand in a similar season in another region. Is that correct?
Yeah, no. So I don't look at demand. I look at the potential for generation. So I simulate capacity for under the different scenarios. So how much you could potentially generate with a specific power plant, and then comparing how those align across the different align or miss. So we're actually looking for misalignments, because you want to be able to balance a rainy season, for example, a rainy season with a dry season. So so you look into negative correlations between the time series of what you could potentially generate. And this is maximum usable capacity. So we don't account for the demand side. This is fully supply.
I see. So you're really, okay. So really you're saying, okay, we're looking at the supply side. And if we had this interconnected grid, could we even out the supply over all these different regions, sort of aside from what's going on with demand?
Yes.
Okay, that helps. I mean, that helps. Thank you. I'll pause there and see if there are any more questions. Do I see one here? Let's see how we're doing for time. I'm curious in the future. I mean, there's this question of, so when you're looking at the potential capacity for hydropower, did you actually look at was this an analysis of if you were to build out future plants? This is what is the maximum, how do you get at the maximum possible hydropower there could be in a region? Can you talk a little bit about how that was?
Yes. So currently, so far, I've done the analysis including existing power plants, and I've included also the Grand Renaissance Dam, which is currently being filled in Ethiopia, but we are not I haven't performed the analysis for future
new plants.
Projects, but the analysis takes into account the power plant characteristics. So when I simulate capacity, I simulated with the power plants, each power plant characteristic. So for example, I take the Grand Renaissance Dam that has a 6 gigawatt installed capacity, and I simulate the reservoir operations and how much you could potentially get if you were to operate it at maximum capacity.
Got it. Okay, I'm getting what it was. Okay, sounds good. Thank you. All right, let's thank our speaker.
Great, thank you.
And let's continue to our next talk. Our next talk is from Quinn at Colorado State University. It's electric pressure cooking on mini-grids, a potential path towards energy sustainability in the global south. Casey, the floor is yours.
Good afternoon, good evening, everybody. That didn't work. There we go. Today I'm going to talk about putting electric pressure cooking on mini-grids. In particular, going to talk about a case study in Rwanda that we looked at. So kind of some background in Rwanda. So about 93% of all cooking energy is biomass in Rwanda to date, and about 80% of that comes from wood, but in reality, most of it is actually wood because the other large percentage is coming from charcoal. And at this current usage rate, they're about 2 times the sustainable level of harvesting. And so obviously that has a lot of potential health implications, both environmentally and also human health wise, because cooking biomass, as you can see, obviously this is not Rwanda, but the smoke inhalation concerns with inside households using biomass is quite high. So kind of some additional background of what are some other potential solutions. Historically, improved cook stoves have been looked at as an option over the last 15 to 20 years. However, adoption rates have been pretty low, even though these are still wood or charcoal-based devices. and the health improvements and efficiency improvements are actually not as quite as great as we had anticipated. And so kind of the next tier of cooking technology, it has been LPG, which historically has been fairly expensive, but it's starting to come in line with pricing of charcoal, especially as the deforestation issues are catching up in a lot of these countries. And so historically it's been fairly expensive, but it's starting to make a stronger push, especially into Africa, as a number of countries are starting to adopt LPG as a solution to try and transition off of biomass cooking. However, there have been some studies that have shown there are some concerns of adoption of LPG due to cost and or taste concerns. An interesting thing on the cost side is that the Happen study, which has been in 4 different countries, one of which is in Rwanda as well, has found that even though the fuel that they're receiving is free, the fact that it takes this long, there's a perception that sometimes cooking with LPG can take longer, especially for things like rice and beans that take a long time to cook. And then LPG obviously has some distribution challenges that's been highlighted recently with COVID, but also historically with natural disasters and rainy season issues in terms of fuel delivery. And then Rwanda has, like many countries in Africa, the added challenge of getting LPG imports, as they typically have to import through yet another country, which can cause some challenges logistically and also increases cost. And then there are some health concerns tied to LPG and natural gas. There's a big push in California right now to transition away from natural gas for both environmental reasons, but also health reasons. So, and lastly is electricity. And historically, electricity has been seen as kind of too expensive for cooking needs throughout the world. But that is starting to change a little bit. And so kind of why are we looking at electric cooking, and why are we looking at pressure cookers in particular? And I'll just refer to them as electric pressure cookers at this point. I'm guessing a lot of you maybe are familiar with the older version of the pressure cooker. They're stovetop. Those are still around, but there's kind of been this big push recently of the Instant Pot movement around the world, where folks are starting to use Instant Pot for electric pressure cooking for the convenience and reduce cooking speeds, primarily due to the efficiency of these pressure cookers. They're fairly well insulated and also fairly cheap devices, but also can reduce cooking times due to the pressurization for things like beans. So you can go from 2 to 3 hours of unsoaked beans to 30 to 40 minutes for cooking those same beans, which is a fairly big transition in terms of energy. And beans tend to be a pretty strong staple in a lot of countries, and especially in Rwanda. So what we did is we have this on the map shown here in Rwanda. So this is an actual layout of some houses in a village in Rwanda. And so what we started with was this initial A group, which is the red line. The B group is kind of a second phase installation that we were kind of modeling here. But we started with this A group, which was roughly about 20 houses that would be connected. And this is just a PV battery system and a 220 volt AC system. And we based this on kind of a worst case scenario when we sized the grid at about 1.5 kilowatt hours per kilowatt PV per day, based on solar radiation data for Rwanda in that area. And then we just said, there would be a 100-watt load per household throughout the day, or peak load. And then we said, okay, well, we take this kind of base grid, which is kind of where a lot of the development of a lot of these grids have gone. There's a lot of these mini grids that are primarily for lighting and providing basic charging of cell phones, but not a lot of appliance use, etc. And so we said, well, what if we go ahead and add 20 pressure cookers? There are a wide range of power ratings for pressure cookers, and a work that we did previously and presented last year at another conference kind of showed that the 700-watt pressure cooker is kind of the optimal for mini grids, and it has to do with the heat up time and insulation and things like that. But essentially we say, well, if you add 20 of these 700-watt cookers, that essentially you're going to increase your peak load by up to 14 kilowatts. So we said, well, is that assumption really correct? I mean, technically, yes, if you had all 14 of these 700-watt pressure cookers kick on at the same time. I mean, people tend to cook roughly at the same time, so that could be a potential challenge. But we said, well, let's look at what's really happening in these pressure cookers. And so here's an example trace of the power and temperature within inside. This is a 1,000 watt pressure cooker, but you see the same thing with 700 watts, slightly longer times with lower power. That's initial startup. So in the blue line, you can see this initial pressurization and heating phase. And then you see these where it drops off, and then you see these over this 30-minute cooking window, you have these kind of quick and intermittent power cycles to where you're maintaining pressure and temperature. So you have a lot of downtime, as you can see, where as you start to overlap these and the stochastic nature of users and also power use of these devices, that you don't necessarily see an overlap and additive effect when you add 20 of these pressure cookers to a grid. So then we said, well, we need some cooking time duration. We had hoped to collect a little more time resolution data, but due to COVID, we haven't started one of our studies in Rwanda. So we leveraged some work from our friends at the Happen project. And so this is from an LPG stove project, intervention project. So this is showing essentially the distribution of cooking during the day and cooking at night. And when those cooking events start. Obviously this is LPG, so the durations and things like that don't really apply, but we could basically assume, let's say that this is when cooking events would start, and we'll use this as our sample distributions to determine when electric pressure cooking would start, and then use the model that we created showing from the example that I showed previously for different cooking durations, etc. And so we took these 20 households and split them into two groups, larger family household for half of them and smaller family households for the other half. And we said, maybe they'll cook rice or beans once in a day. Sometimes they'll cook twice a day. Sometimes they won't cook at all. So we have these distributions built in. I don't have a lot of time to go into that, but this paper is out there. If you have interest in looking at it a little closer, we can talk a little bit later, as well as how we broke up these distributions and how we simulate this in Monte Carlo. But then we assumed that roughly this electric pressure cooking is going to be about 50% of the cooking needs of these 20 houses in this community. So when we throw this into the Monte Carlo and simulate for 5 years, obviously this is just a high-level simulation. There's not any of the grid dynamics and things like that. We have another student kind of working through that right now. But what we wanted to say is, how much overlap do you have in these cooking events, and how does that impact the peak power, and also what does that look like for daily energy demand? So we did this for a 5-year simulation, and so that question that I posed initially was, do we really need 14 kilowatts of peak power? And actually, through our simulations, it looks like it is substantially less. It's about 6 kilowatts of peak power as you're spreading out these cooking events throughout the day and into the evening as well. And then a roughly 8 kilowatt hour per day consumption on storage. So we take this information and we kind of built out our model. So and put some cost to this system and what it would be. And so we have a 5 kilowatt PV system, and we bumped it up to a 10 kilowatt hour lithium pack, and said, well, if with a 10-year payback and 10% interest, this gives us an operating cost of roughly about $1.70 per kilowatt hour, which is about 70 cents per day for electric pressure cooking, which is fairly expensive. And this is including the cooking and the 100-watt baseload for these households. So we looked around and said, well, there are these programs. And so, Rwanda and a number of other countries are starting to build out their grids, but more for normal use, and also doing some microgrid initially with the intention that they will be integrated into the national grid long term. And so there are a couple of projects in Tanzania and Uganda slated that the countries are providing the infrastructure, but they're looking for private investments to provide the generation for the minigrid. And so what we did is we said, well, what if we take out the connection costs of our assumptions and just look at the generation costs and a fraction of that for the installation costs, and then what does that do to our costs overall for the system? And so for this 20 household system, that brings us to a little less than $1 per kilowatt hour, or about 40 cents per day. And so we said, well, okay, well, how does that compare? So these two different scenarios, and again, this is for 50% of the daily cooking needs estimate. And so this is just an estimate that we have of about 1.5 to 2.5 kilowatt hours per day. What people are using for half the time, you have to double that for full energy consumption. And so here we kind of have a spread of the electric pressure cooking full system, economics accounted for, and then generation only, and then comparing that to LPG and charcoal in Rwanda. And as you can see, if the infrastructure is required, it's not going to be super cost competitive, but there are scenarios if you expand that to a larger system to the full system like we showed, or reduce some costs here and there with PV and batteries and whatnot. So it can be competitive. So kind of some conclusions that we came to is that electric pressure cookers can be integrated in microgrid or mini grids for some cooking applications, but probably not for everything. And this can be what we term as kind of fuel stacking. I mean, if you think about how you cook in your house, you have more than one appliance. So this, could pair well with something like LPG or charcoal, where those LPG and charcoal is used for shorter cooking events and things like that. It can be cost competitive with other clean fuels, and it can help reduce traditional fuel, hopefully, then showing that the cooking times are shorter and maybe you'll have more adoption. And this, obviously, it's also a new technology, and the adoption is a big question. But we think that electricity and electric pressure cooking really should be part of the conversation and development and energy access that's being spun out. And this, type of work has also been done by MEXA in the UK for systems in Kenya and Tanzania. So we're not really doing this in a vacuum. So some future work, like I said, we were hoping to get more time resolved LPG data and pairing food type cooking data with the time of day use, which we hope to be doing in the next couple of months, part of our shear project. We also want to integrate this into, take our Monte Carlo simulation and expand upon that and build it into a true system where we have, voltage drop and whatnot, and also include investigate hybrid systems rather than just purely PV and storage. And there are some interesting overlaps and fuels that are available in Rwanda as well. And so finally, the last thing, as we increase these household numbers, we have some concerns there will be some overlaps. We're looking into ways to minimize peak power and keep too many pressure cookings cooking at once. And then finally add in some health analyses. So with that, I'd like to thank the folks at CSU and our partners at the HAPPEN study and also the LACE study based out of the UK. So I'll take any questions.
Okay, very interesting. We have some questions from the audience. You can either raise your hand and become on the podium or type it with the question mark at the bottom. It says ask. All right, I'll ask a question then. In the economic comparison where your charcoal was one of the items, and I'm imagining that the situation you're looking at is rural villages. And I'm wondering whether the charcoal that is generally used in rural villages, is this something that is bought at a market, or is this something that may be made by people after collecting the wood?
So in Rwanda, in Rwanda, typically charcoal is purchased. There is also, it has been a push. I don't remember if it's been fully implemented or not, but there has been some restrictions put onto charcoal production in Rwanda due to the deforestation issues. And so I think they're trying to regulate it at the national level. So most charcoal is purchased rather than produced locally. So
okay, so people will go to the market, they'll go to a market. So
Yeah.
people in smaller villages will go to a town or somewhere, a larger community, and buy charcoal for cooking.
If they are using charcoal, yeah.
If they're using charcoal, okay.
Yeah. So.
Okay, thank you. Any question from this from the audience? Wait a second. One raised hand. I think a raised hand means you put. Okay, so Megan says there's a raised hand, and I think when they raise hand, can you put the person on the podium? There we go.
Hi, Casey. Thanks for the presentation. That was really interesting. I'm curious what your thoughts are on the uptake of an electric pressure cooker in terms of how similar it is to other cooking types and cooking approaches used, and what kind of social uptake and interest there is in that kind of cooking device in the first place.
No, that is a great question, and the MEX group has done a lot of work in this, and they've primarily been focused on urban at this point, but in Kenya they've actually seen a lot of strong interest in the electric pressure cookers, and primarily been showing the reduced cooking time. That's a really big factor, and showing hey, this takes 30 minutes to do beans instead of 3 hours, and you can kind of walk away and you don't have to do anything. And so they have shown a large interest. Our collaborators in LACE based out of the UK, did a similar study, but not electric pressure cooking, and did stovetop LPG pressure cooking systems. And their intervention was actually so successful that they had community members who weren't part of the, who were in the control group coming up to them being like, hey, where can we buy these? And they had to figure out how to figure that, to get them more, because there was a strong interest in using them, because they basically saw the savings that came from using them. So in the rural settings, there still is some questions as to how well they'll be adopted, but does seem interesting.
Thanks.
So, yep.
That's great. Thanks.
Great question. We should move on, and if there may be time at the end to ask more questions, we'll see how it goes. But for now, I think we should press on to the third talk, which is from Jorge Izar-Tenorio from Carnegie Mellon University, and it's finding effects of small-scale irrigation on land use, crop productivity, and electricity requirements in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda through an integrated modeling systems approach. Jorge, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Eric. So yeah, this is the in our study that I did with Dr. Paulina Jaramillo and Dr. Nathan Williams, we tried to find what are the effects of using pressurized irrigation in small-scale agriculture in East Africa. We start by finding that, first of all, agriculture and economic growth go in different directions depending on three main metrics. So in this case, urbanization and electrification go hand in hand, while the agricultural share of GDP actually goes in an opposite direction. So pretty much what we found first, the motivation of my talk or my study is that pretty much electricity and urbanization should make the share of agriculture, the share of GDP by agriculture, that should be a little bit, that should be going down. And we found that agriculture in many African economies are actually in the opposite direction. While they are many, in most countries in Africa, they are highly rural, and also the agricultural share of GDP is super high, well, in most of these countries, as you can see on the left-hand side. And they also employ a high percentage of the population. So those were some of the motivations, together with that the sub-Saharan Africa is the global region with the highest untapped agricultural potential, and that including the untapped water resources and unachieved yields, especially for staple crops. Also, Africa currently has a very small percentage of its land irrigated, and it uses also a very conventional supply of inputs, as in the form of fertilizers or seeds, and they are among the lowest in the world, even lower than other countries such as South Asia, or even the North African countries as well. That, together with the electricity access and the consumption rates in Africa, both of them, well, all of them combined, hamper or obstruct the ability of investors to recover some of these investments. And our study wanted to find in what we tried to do in a high resolution manner, in what countries, in what districts in Ethiopia, Rwanda, and Uganda would have the techno-economic potential such that investors could have some confidence that they could invest in, for instance, electricity infrastructure and also in irrigation infrastructure, such that a small-scale agriculture could thrive and they could recover their investments. At the same time, we want to see what are the effects of this small-scale irrigation infrastructure in other aspects, such as crop productivity, also land use, and also the electricity loads that this can provide and that can translate into a meaningful electricity consumption for investors. So my analysis framework was an integrated assessment approach that is based in agronomic, economic, and hydrologic factors. So basically what I did was to use a crop growth model, and then I built an engineering-based irrigation model, and also a simplified hydrology model to assess as outputs. We wanted to get the yields, what were the irrigation requirements, how much electricity we could was required for those irrigation requirements, and if there was water available to irrigate these districts in these three countries. So in total, I did these simulations using historical climate data from 2010 to 2019 and created a total of 320 scenarios per district based on 5 crops per country. Each country had 3 staple crops and 2 horticulture crops. These horticultural crops were supposed to be premium crops, or a little bit like higher price crops. Also 2 seasons, rainy and dry, 2 watering modes, irrigated and rain-fed, 4 fertility levels, low, moderate, near optimal, and non-limiting, and 2 seed varieties as low and high yield cultivars. Based on that, I found from my simulations with the crop growth model, I found that irrigation can increase yields by up to a factor of almost 4, and a little bit more than 2, almost 4 in Ethiopia, and a little bit more than 2 in Uganda, and about 2 in Rwanda. And this was for mainly horticultural crops. But we also found that there is good value in irrigating staples. However, this only happens for improved cultivars and for non-limiting or high fertility scenarios. We also found that for lower fertility scenarios, the margins are actually negative sometimes, or the margins are really small. In terms of irrigation requirements, and we found that like the idea of this graph is to show in which districts the irrigation requirements are not super high, and that we can find, we can see that the irrigation requirements here are in units of millimeters per ton. So we would like ideally to not spend that much water. So we find that the most efficient areas in these 3 countries for water consumption or water irrigation demand were in central Ethiopia, southwestern Rwanda, and northwestern Uganda. At the same time, we also assessed the economic viability or feasibility of the different crops in each country, and like coming back to what I said before a little bit, that only under high fertility scenarios and using the high yield cultivars, we can find some good economic viability for staples. The economic viability is usually higher for horticulture crops. In this graph, the vertical dashed lines are supposed to represent the crop prices of the different crops in this panel. And we also came up with this metric that we call the levelized cost of irrigation, which is how many the US dollars per metric ton that for every one of the different crops. And we compare that to the crop price. So here we see that everything to the left of these dashed lines would be something economically feasible, and everything to the right would be unfeasible. So if we look at the different panels, we will see that, for instance, the low fertility scenario, which is in the lower side of each one of the 3 rows, most of the districts are actually above the levelized cost of irrigation, above the crop price, sorry. Also, we assessed the techno-economic feasibility, adding the hydrological model, the simplified hydrological model, to find if there was enough water and where in such case would that happen. And we found that the highest techno-economic feasibility for small-scale pressurized irrigation occurs for horticultural crops in Ethiopia central western, Rwanda's western half, and Uganda's southeastern and northwestern. So in these countries, we also found that in Ethiopia, the range of districts with irrigation feasibility can go from 16 to 33% across cultivars and fertility levels. In Rwanda, is from 17 to 67%, and Uganda is from 14 to 44%, also across cultivars and fertility levels. We also found, we also aggregated the electricity consumption of irrigation for irrigation in the 3 countries, and we found that the annual projected electricity for irrigation equals or is equal to 17% of the total power consumption in Ethiopia and Uganda, and about 65% of the total power consumption in Rwanda, which this would actually give some of investors a little bit more confidence that there is meaningful ways to use electricity and like have this double dividend between agriculture and electricity. And finally, well, second to last, finally, irrigation can reduce the land used for agriculture, for planting staples by up to 95% in Ethiopia, almost 60% in Rwanda, and almost 90% in Uganda. This is obviously dependent on the specific location, but these are more or less the numbers that we came up with. And also, there are also other benefits that are probably not as easily monetized from using irrigation, and those come in the form of food security. In light of that, irrigation can reduce the yield variability across years and can make yields more predictable pretty much for all fertility levels. And finally, as a conclusion, we found that irrigation is financially viable in the 3 countries as long as they go hand in hand with using modern inputs, such as especially fertilizers, but also seed varieties. And obviously there is also the price of the crop that is also involved in this, but well, that's not exactly the subject of this study. We also found that irrigation can increase crop productivity and improve the land use efficiency, and at the same time provide meaningful electricity loads for investors to be more confident about their investments. And finally, using a decision support tool that incorporates different techno-economic aspects could help decision makers about finding opportunities for co-investment in both electricity and small-scale pressurized irrigation infrastructure in East Africa. And that is all. Thank you.
Okay, we don't have a ton of time for questions, but please, let's hear from our audience. Please raise your hand or type in a text question. Well, I have a question. So if you remember that slide where you're showing the levelized cost of irrigation and you're comparing it with the income from crops, one thing I'm puzzled about is that irrigation is not the only cost in agriculture. They have to pay for the ingredients, you have to pay for the labor. I mean, is all those costs, are all the costs of agriculture included in the LCOI, or is it only the irrigation costs?
It's only the irrigation costs. So far,
okay, so then you can't, unless you've included the other costs, it seems difficult to comment on the profitability of irrigation.
Yeah, of course. This is a metric that is faulted. Like it is based on many assumptions. So it only includes the operation costs such as energy consumption. That was one of the main inputs that we wanted to.
So you haven't included if they use fertilizers or labor or other things, it's not in there.
No, fertilizers or labor, not yet. Okay. Only borehole drilling, energy consumption, also equipment.
Okay. Understood. Very interesting. Any last short questions from the studio audience? Okay, if not, thanks. And let's press on. Let's move on to the fourth talk. And it's from Dharik Mallapragada at MIT. Impact of supply and demand side drivers on the decarbonization of the electricity sector in India. Dharik, please take it away.
Let me just share my screen. Hello, everyone. My name is Dharik Mallapragada. I'd like to tell you a little bit about a project that we are in the process of wrapping up right now, looking at the impact of supply and demand side drivers for the electricity system evolution in the Indian context. Mark Babar is the PhD student working with me, and Rob Stoner at the MIT Energy Initiative on this project. So the main motivation for this work kind of starts by just looking at where the Indian electricity system stands today. So if we step back and just look at India's role in global emissions and the larger climate mitigation strategies, India already represents the third largest CO2 emitter by country. But this is in large part driven by its predominant reliance on coal for primary energy, most of which ends up being used for electricity generation, with some amount going for industrial uses. So this large carbon footprint today is driven by the reliance on coal with its very large population. But if you sort of then put it in context of emissions per capita, India lags pretty much behind most developed countries in terms of metrics regarding emissions intensity per capita. So the message here is that while this footprint is already quite large, it could grow even larger unless mitigation strategies as well as technological approaches are conceived and implemented at the scale that's needed in the Indian context. Sorry, I apologize. For some reason, it seems to be taking longer to transition than I imagined. So if we focus in on the electricity system in India, which is where most of the coal is currently consumed, the electricity sector is amongst the fastest growing demand growth sectors in India. And unlike in many other regions where particularly in the US, in Europe, and other parts of the world where EVs are the dominant use of future electricity demand and are the dominant drivers for future electricity demand growth, in India, the building sector is projected to be the largest driver for electricity consumption, which is primarily driven by the increasing demand for air conditioners, given the climatic conditions spanning the entire country, and growing middle class in the population. So this kind of raises a number of challenging questions as we think about electricity system planning for the long term, because air conditioning use tends to be relatively inflexible and tends to correspond to not only increases in total consumption but also increases in peak consumption, and driving up peak consumption. So a recent estimate from the IEA looked at the contribution of space cooling in electricity demand for India today and in other regions, and it stands at around 10%. But this number is projected to significantly increase to almost as high as 45% in their reference scenario, representing a significant strain on the electricity system from a capacity perspective. So this raises questions about, how do we think about the electricity system evolution, given this substantial growth in air conditioning demand, and in particular, are there demand side measures we can take to mitigate the adverse effects of AC use on peak demand, while also thinking simultaneously about decarbonization of the electricity system, which today relies heavily on coal. So this study has focused on trying to answer some of these questions. So our approach here, because we're looking at a question that's very much related on the demand side as well as has implications on the supply side, is to look at an integrated supply-demand framework. The framework starts by looking at developing a bottom-up demand estimation model that looks at business as usual factors influencing electricity consumption, plus looks at new technology drivers and adoption drivers that are driving up new demand growths like air conditioning, but also electric vehicles. And using insights from this demand estimation model, we feed it into a capacity expansion planning framework, which is often used in electricity system planning and resource planning, and has been a subject of previous presentations at this conference already, to understand sort of the long-term outlook, both from a supply perspective to meet these demand scenarios that we would generate from the demand side modeling. So the capacity expansion model here is trying to look at least cost investment in dispatch, starting out from now all the way to 2050 on a decadal time scale. What is the role for various types of generation resources, but also how demand side measures could influence the need for these generation resources. So just a little bit more about the demand side analysis. So as you can imagine, in a country like India, much of the data related to electricity consumption is fairly limited in scope, and so when we're thinking about building models to understand the demand side, we had to work with the constraints of the limited data that's available, which mostly is around daily energy consumption with 1 year of hourly historical energy consumption that we have. That said, we used that kind of information and coupled it with many other often used drivers to estimate demand growth in the future, such as GDP, but also weather pattern variations, to understand sort of business as usual growth or business as usual load and its growth as a function of time. And here, essentially, we're using a regression model to fit to the daily energy consumption data, and then looking at the hourly energy consumption data that we have for a given year to sort of understand the temporal patterns in energy use. We cannot do the same for air conditioning and EVs, primarily because there is just limited use of these appliances today. And so we really don't have any historical data to lean on. So in this case, we are using basically a bottom-up modeling that looks at survey data regarding the use of these appliances both in residential and commercial settings, along with vehicle sales and EV projections and efficiency assumptions and their growth and their evolution over time from the IEA Future of Cooling study in the case of air conditioning. So putting these two together, what we end up getting is not only annual estimates of electricity consumption for the various periods of interest, but also a granular understanding of sort of the hourly load profiles at both a state and a regional level that helps us to understand how it will impact the electricity system from the supply side. So quickly going through some results from this analysis. So here I'm describing the reference scenario for our modeling work, where we look at where we have basically baseline assumptions for AC efficiency, where India's air conditioning sales weighted AC efficiency as of today continues to follow historical trends of AC sales and is slightly lower than global averages. We have natural gas prices which are consistent with imported natural gas costs. We don't have any policies regarding decarbonization, and we're looking at a fairly high cost of capital consistent with developing country context. And so under this scenario, what we see is that there's massive potential for renewables deployment over the next decade, whereby you're seeing wind and solar getting deployed in large quantities to basically support the new demand growth, to the extent that wind, in this reference scenario, wind and solar contribute about almost half of total generation in 2030. However, as demand continues to grow further out into the other decades, you see that even though wind and solar generation continues to grow, there is need for thermal resources to be deployed towards the end of the decade, because wind and solar resources are basically not growing fast enough to meet the growth in demand and are outpaced by the growth in demand. And the value decline that stems from increasing renewables penetration essentially means that their economic deployment levels tend to plateau out compared to the growth in demand. So what you end up with a scenario is in 2050, emissions are much higher than in 2020 under this scenario, even though emissions intensity as a whole has been declining over this period. So building off this reference scenario, we looked at a number of different counterfactual experiments to understand the impact of technology drivers both on the supply and demand side. So in this particular example, we looked at the role for battery storage costs and alternative scenarios for cost assumptions for battery storage. And given the dominance of solar, we find that shifting to lower battery storage costs has a massive impact in terms of the renewables deployment, because it significantly raises the value of solar to shift its energy from the daytime to the nighttime, which is when the major demand peak tends to occur in India. And so this results in a massive decline in emissions. On the other hand, having cheaper natural gas does have an effect in terms of reducing the amount of new coal capacity shown in the pink relative to the reference case, but this effect is relatively muted on an emissions basis, because cheaper natural gas basically substitutes partly for coal, but it also tends to substitute for renewables in some instances, and so you get a net effect that is not that different from the reference scenario on an emissions basis. The note here is that across these scenarios, if you start to look at the levels of energy capacity deployment, India could be really one of the largest markets for energy storage by mid-century, given the scale of demand in this region. So just to give you one estimate, this number tends to be in the range of numbers that are projected by BNEF for global energy storage deployments by 2040. So on the demand side, we can, through the modeling framework that we have developed here, we can also look at the effect of, improvements in AC efficiency. And here's where we find something quite interesting, in that higher AC efficiency leads to reductions in peak demand. So as seen on the chart on the right here, peak demand tends to be much lower than the reference scenario. However, and it also reduces total consumption, which means that your total capacity deployment is also reduced. You also get emissions reduction in 2030 resulting from high AC efficiency. However, the catch here is that as you are flattening the demand, and because of the strong role of AC use in peak demand, the flattening of demand tends to favor baseload resources like coal more so than solar resources, which tend to have a clear peaky nature to them. And so what you end up with is an increased utilization of coal resources in the high AC efficiency case as a proportion of the total demand, resulting in slightly higher emissions in the high AC efficiency case in the long term relative to the reference case. So the takeaway here is that yes, demand side measures have a significant role in the short term and also reduce overall capacity needs and are thus favorable, but have to be accompanied by other measures to mitigate the role for existing and new coal generation. So just to illustrate this point, here I'm highlighting the dispatch profile simulated for the year 2050 between the reference case and the high AC efficiency case, where you can see that the peaks, which tend to occur offset from the daytime hours, mostly in the nighttime hours, are reduced significantly. But you also see the greater role for coal generation relative to the total supply stack that results in slightly greater emissions and certainly higher emissions intensity compared to the reference case. So we also wanted to look at, given the insights we're getting from the technological scenarios, both on the demand and supply side, we looked at a case where, how does this complement with the role that policy can play in decarbonizing the Indian electricity system. So here I'm comparing a reference scenario versus the all-inclusive technology scenario, both on the demand and supply side. And we've seen this comparison previously, where predominantly the effect of low storage leads to reduced emissions. You can get to much lower emissions with a modest carbon price, but the full effect of the carbon price in terms of cost impacts could be pretty significant in 2030. However, if you're including the low carbon price scenario and considering the technological drivers both on the supply and demand side, you can get to still lower emissions, but also mitigating some of the cost implications associated with decarbonization in these scenarios. So with that, I'll basically stop by just kind of highlighting some of the key takeaways. The business as usual scenario, similar to other studies that have recently looked at this question, leads to large deployment of renewables in India by the next decade. However, the catch here is that as demand grows faster and further in the later half of in the later part of our model horizon, we see emissions ultimately growing and outpacing the growth in renewables. We do see sort of AC efficiency on the demand side, reducing consumption and producing short-term emission savings and also cost reductions, but this needs to be complemented with methods to restrict coal generation. Otherwise, in our modeling, we find that long-term emissions reductions may not be guaranteed with high AC efficiency measures. And one thing I didn't talk about here, but is also included in our study, is around, peak demand not only affects the transmission system, but also affects the distribution system. And so distribution level storage becomes increasingly important in these types of settings to manage congestion in urban settings. So with that, I'll stop and turn it over to Eric for questions.
Very interesting. Questions, please. Okay, I'll jump in. So I saw huge, I saw a lot of wind and solar capacity being built, but not a lot of fossil fuel. And so I'm wondering if there's a hot, cloudy, and still day, as in not a lot of wind, is there enough firm capacity to supply the grid?
Yeah, so the interesting thing is that India has a lot of existing coal capacity in the system, as well as hydro resources and so all of the growth in wind and solar that you were seeing was basically making up for the growth in demand. And so you still have a lot of thermal capacity in the system under the reference scenario that basically and that's relatively young, that lasts until about 2040, until which there's no.
Okay, so basically these resources are probably being used at other times. I mean, basically a bunch of excess capacity that they can be applied to the peaking on bad renewable days. Is that what?
Right. What I mean? Yep. Yeah. So I mean, the capacity factors for the thermal resources are quite low, but that's
yeah, right. Yeah, they're going to be losing money, right? Because solar and wind are going to be taking all their business. Okay, got it. Great. Other questions? Oh, wait, I think I see a question. Text. Okay, so it's a question from Basil Terabe. How was the increase in electricity demand from EVs considered based on their sales? Is it an increase per one EV that is used? If so, what is roughly the increase in electricity demand in that case?
Yeah, so one of the interesting things about markets like India is that, the predominant, so if you look at the sales of light duty vehicles, two-wheelers dominate four-wheelers. And so, what we did was we basically looked at sales of the various modes of light duty vehicle transport, and then looked at projections by the IEA sort of on EV demand growth in India, and sort of juxtapose those two together. So what you're looking at in terms of electricity demand use from EV is based on a profile that's data we have taken from a survey done in Mexico City, which is the closest analog we could think of, sort of an urban setting similar to India, and that represents sort of generally workplace charging as the major driver, but it represents a scaled up estimate of what large adoption of EVs would be. It's not a single EV that's being represented and just multiply tenfold. We account for coincidence effects and things like that.
Okay. Well, any other?
Yeah, I will mention that the paper and the data set is available. So, if there are questions that I'm happy to field them.
I think I don't see any other questions. I have one more then, and that is in forecasting the adoption of air conditioning. I mean, one approach would be historical retrospective forecasting, or one could have a model that says as a function of GDP and changing preferences. How can you talk about how that was done?
Yeah, so we took, we leaned on the IEA future of cooling studies, reference scenario and high AC efficiency scenarios in terms of sales projection going forward. And,